Nonetheless, I'm here to try to speak the truth, what the Philippines needs to do to achieve inclusive growth, that is growth for the majority of our people. So where are we now? According to NEDA, the Philippines is no longer the sick man of Asia, and that between 2010 to 2014, it has posted an average of 6.2% growth, the highest five-year growth the past 40 years. But, and it's a big but, the growth has not been inclusive. Unemployment is still very high. About a quarter of our labor force, or 24.2%, are either unemployed or underemployed. Poverty incidence has barely moved, with about a quarter of Filipinos being poor. While hunger showed a decline to the lowest in 10 years, with about 12.7% of respondents saying they experienced involuntary hunger once in the past 3 months, it could be because the country has not experienced a devastating typhoon like Yolanda, and inflation has moderated to 1.2%. In other words, growth has not been inclusive. It has mainly benefited the rich. We may quibble about walang korap, but certainly marami pa rin ang mahirap. If growth has not been inclusive, it's because there has been no structural reforms. Economic growth is still mainly consumption-driven. Take away OFW remittances, you take away growth. What then should we do to attain inclusive growth, to make growth work for the majority of our people? If Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has his 3 arrows to cure the Japanese economic malaise, namely quantitative easing in monetary policy, robust spending in fiscal policy, and structural reforms, I propose 5 arrows to achieve inclusive economic growth. The 5 arrows address the big binding constraints to sustainable, inclusive growth. The first arrow is openness to foreign investment. In particular, we need constitutional change to remove the foreign ownership restrictions in the Constitution. Why, you might ask? Even local investors who are not restricted are not investing. This is shown by the fact that the investment rate is quite low, at 20% of GDP, compared to about 25% in Malaysia, 33% in Indonesia, and 47.2% in China. Our banks are awash in liquidity. Instead of lending to businesses, they're lending to consumers through credit cards and parking their funds in the BSP. If local investors are not investing, why is it so important to remove the foreign ownership restrictions in the Constitution? The answer is that there are monopolies and duopolies in strategic sectors of the economy: ports, telecommunications, airports, power distribution, shipping, etc. These strategic sectors strangle the growth of the rest of the economy with their high prices and bad service. One example is telecommunications, where we have the highest prices, bad service, and slowest internet speeds in Asia. We need to have well-capitalized foreign companies to provide competition in these strategic sectors, but because of the 60-40 rule in the ownership of public utilities in the Constitution, they cannot. Without lifting these foreign ownership restrictions in the Constitution, we also cannot join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the economic foundation of the U.S. rebalancing toward Asia. Vietnam and Malaysia, which have no foreign ownership restrictions in their constitution, have already joined. Investors who want to have preferred access to the markets of TPP members, Japan and the United States, will go to those countries instead of the Philippines. Incidentally, Vietnam, a socialist country which has fought foreign invaders, has recently allowed majority ownership by foreigners in most industries. The second arrow is modernizing the labor code, so the focus is on labor productivity and employment rather than unrealistic high minimum wages with no relation to productivity and labor security. The effect of our current labor code is to discourage employment in upgrading the skills of our labor force. Small and medium-scale industries were the biggest generators of employment are not going to hire in large numbers. According to the World Bank, the Philippines has one of the highest minimum wages relative to average wages in the world. It has the most unproductive minimum wage earners in the world. A study by Dr. Vic Paqueo, an economist from the Philippine Institute of Development Studies, the government think tank, shows that the current high minimum wages deters employment, especially among the youth, the uneducated, and women. It is therefore anti-youth, anti-women, and anti-uneducated. The focus of the current labor code on labor permanency after 6 months also deters companies from hiring. They often resort to labor contracting organizations who fire workers before 6 months. This results in labor unable to absorb more skills and training in a particular job. We therefore need to modernize the labor code. It is the key to developing more labor-intensive industries and generating employment. It is the key to attract foreign investors to invest in labor-intensive industries in our country who are now fleeing China because of a shortage in labor to countries like Vietnam and Indonesia, but not the Philippines. The third arrow is to dramatically improve our agricultural productivity. We need to improve agricultural productivity for many reasons. One of which is that the majority of poor people are in the countryside. We need to raise rural incomes in order to make a dent in rural poverty. However, what is holding back agricultural growth and agricultural productivity? 3 main reasons. The biggest obstacle to agricultural growth and productivity is the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program, or CARP. According to the World Bank, CARP is the most successful land distribution program in the world, with about 87% of targeted lands having been successfully distributed. However, 28 years after its passage in 1987, have we seen rising incomes, more employment, increased productivity, and reduced poverty in the countryside? No. Why? First of all, because of the uncertainty of property rights fostered by CARP, there's not been much investment in agriculture. Why would people invest if there's a possibility that the lands will be taken away from them? Second, as designed, the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law's prohibition of ownership beyond 5 hectares prevents efficient farmers from ever buying out inefficient ones. Successful farmers cannot scale because CARP prohibits them from doing so. This is why even agriculture officials admit that the average farmer is now 57 years old. The young ones see no future in farming. What do we need to do? First, we need to end CARP, period. No more extensions, no more CARPer, nor CARPest. Tama na, sobra na after 28 years. Second, we need to amend the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law. The suggestion of Dr. Raul Fabella, National Scientist for Economics, is that CARP beneficiaries should be able to legally lease their CLOAS or Certificate of Land Ownership awards. The lease income acts as a safety net for beneficiaries, but the lease also allows inefficient ones to let more efficient farmers to use the land. Aside from amending CARL, what do we need to do to increase agricultural productivity? We have to stop using the majority of our agricultural budget on rice, a low value-added agricultural commodity. We have no competitive advantage in rice production, lacking the alluvial plains of Vietnam and Thailand. And instead, like Malaysia, we should rely on trade for food security. Finally, we have to liberalize rice importation by removing the National Food Authority's monopoly on rice importation. The NFA's monopoly on rice importation has resulted in massive corruption among our agricultural officials and high domestic rice prices. Our countrymen are paying nearly twice as much for rice as consumers in countries like Vietnam. High rice prices translate to higher wages and therefore make our industries less competitive. High rice prices also mean that the poor, which includes rice farmers who are net consumers of rice, spend more of their budget on food. Let me summarize then what we need to do to increase agricultural productivity, increase investments, and reduce poverty in the countryside. End CARP, amend CARP to allow for the leasing of lands, remove NFA's monopoly on rice importation, and focus more on high value-added agricultural products, whether they're vegetables, coffee, cacao, or mangoes. The fourth arrow is a competitive exchange rate. Our monetary authorities are saying that their policy is inflation targeting and not exchange rate targeting. And under a regime of free capital flows, it cannot manage the exchange rate. I'm not advocating capital controls, which are banned under international trade agreements, nor am I saying that the BSP bears sole responsibility for a competitive currency. What I'm advocating is a national policy that is a coordinated, proactive stance from both the BSP and the executive to deliberately prevent the peso from strengthening and to weaken the peso relative to other currencies. How do we do this? First, the BSP should be more aggressive in purchasing dollars. As national scientists Dr. Raul Fabella and Dr. Vic Abola have shown, money creation from the purchases of dollars in an open trade regime is not inflationary because liberalized imports temper any kind of inflationary pressures. All the more so when the world faces structural deflation, that is overcapacity and lack of demand. All over the world, the US, Japan, Europe, China, Russia, and even Thailand, they are fighting deflation rather than inflation. The Philippines just posted an inflation rate of 1.2%, the lowest in 20 years. The BSP, therefore, can be more aggressive in purchasing dollars to weaken the peso. Second, the national government should undertake massive infrastructure spending, not only because building infrastructure will lower the cost of doing business in the Philippines, but also to dramatically increase the demand for capital imports, which will increase the demand for dollars and weaken the peso. Third, as I mentioned earlier, we need to liberalize rice importation. Apart from the benefit of lower rice prices, rice importation will drive the demand for dollars and weaken the peso. Even as the national government is doing everything to drive demand for dollars and weaken the peso, the government should also drive down the cost of doing business in the Philippines. from improving competition through charter change and refraining from declaring more official holidays. What are the benefits of a weak peso? Domestic manufacturers will be shielded by high import prices and help curb smuggling. Make our exports from coffee to call center services more competitive. Increase the purchasing power of overseas Filipino workers and boost growth in the retail, housing, and educational service sectors. Boost tourism and protect agriculture, which is a high domestic value added. The fifth and final arrow is institutional reform. The four arrows are useless if institutions are corrupt or inefficient, because it's institutions in government which wield the four arrows. Institutional reform covers a lot, but I would like to focus on a particular reform, the strengthening of the political party system. Without a strong political party system, we cannot hold our leaders accountable. If party switching is rampant, how can we punish the people who gave us the terrible traffic mess we are experiencing now? All the Asian countries that experienced high growth rates and reduced poverty had political parties behind them. The PAP in Singapore, the Communist Party of China in China, Kuomintang in Taiwan, UMNO in Malaysia, Golkar in Indonesia, and the LDP in Japan. We have to ban political turncoatism and institute public financing of political parties and campaigns. To sum up, to reduce poverty, generate investment, create jobs, and curb unemployment, I propose 5 arrows. First is charter change to remove the foreign ownership restrictions in the Constitution. Second is to modernize the labor code to focus on productivity and employment. Third is to improve agricultural productivity by amending CARP and liberalizing rice importation. And fourth is to deliberately make the peso more competitive. The fifth and final arrow is institutional reform, which is about improving state capacity and democratic accountability. I know what I'm saying is not politically correct. It's far easier to talk about keeping away foreigners, increasing minimum wages, or protecting rice farmers. However, we have no choice. For so long as we cling to the same old discredited ideas, marami pa rin ang magiging mahirap. Unlike Greece, which has its European creditors telling it what to do to modernize its economy, we have no one but ourselves. We can no longer follow the same old rhetoric. For the sake of our people, we have to grasp these arrows and make them fly. Maraming salamat po.